The rain did not stop for the burial. It hammered against the mahogany casket, a rhythmic, hollow sound that drowned out the priest. Angelus stood at the edge of the grave, her gaze fixed on the wet wood as the earth began to fall. Beside her, 10-year-old Leo dug his fingers into her palm, his breathing shallow and jagged. She did not look at the crowd. She did not need to. She could hear them. The board members of Vance Industries stood in a tight circle a few yards away. Their heads bowed, but their voices carried over the wind. They were not mourning. They were calculating. Angelus felt the shift in the air, a cold, predatory focus that had nothing to do with the man in the ground, and everything to do with what he had left behind. She squeezed Leo's hand, pulling him closer, anchoring herself against the rising tide of their indifference. The service was over, but the real struggle had only just begun. She turned away from the grave, leading him toward the waiting cars. The drive back to the estate was silent. Leo stared out the window, his forehead pressed against the cold glass, while Angelus watched the gates approach. She expected the house to be a sanctuary, a place where the weight of the day could finally be set aside. Instead, the front entrance felt wrong. The heavy doors were ajar, and the usual staff was nowhere to be seen. She pushed the main door open, the sound echoing through the foyer. The house felt hollow, stripped of its warmth. She led Leo toward the study, but the handle did not turn. The lock had been replaced, the mechanism clicking with a sharp, metallic finality that stopped them in their tracks. Angelus did not hesitate. She gripped the handle, braced her shoulder, and forced the door inward. It swung open to reveal a scene of calculated disruption. Marcus Thorne sat behind her father's desk, his boots resting on the polished surface. He did not stand. He did not offer a greeting. He simply watched them, his fingers drumming against the wood. The takeover was no longer a suspicion. It was a physical reality occupying the center of their home. Thorne did not waste time with pleasantries. He reached into a leather folder and slid a stack of thick, cream-colored documents across the mahogany surface. The papers skidded, stopping just inches from the edge. He watched Angelus with eyes that held no trace of empathy. "The company needs stability, not a teenager," Thorne said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. He gestured toward the documents with a flick of his chin. "Sign the transfer of guardianship and the proxy voting rights for Leo's shares. It is a simple trade. You get a generous trust fund, and we get the company." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it felt heavy in the room. He looked at Leo, who stood trembling behind Angelus, then back at her. "Do not make this difficult. You are out of your depth." He tapped a pen against the desk, the rhythmic clicking punctuating his demand. He treated them like obstacles to be cleared. Angelus stared at the signature line, the ink waiting for her to surrender everything her father had spent a lifetime building. Angelus looked down at the documents. The ink on the signature line seemed to pulse under the harsh desk lamp. She glanced at Leo. He was gripping her hand so tightly his knuckles were white, his breath hitching in shallow, jagged bursts. The sight of his fear snapped the tension in her chest. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a sharp, icy clarity. She did not reach for the pen. She did not speak to Thorne. Instead, she stepped back, pulling Leo with her. Thorne's expression shifted from smug expectation to irritation as he realized his ultimatum had failed. He started to rise, his chair scraping harshly, but Angelus was already moving. She turned toward the door, her pace deliberate. Every step across the hardwood floor felt like a reclamation of ground. She reached the threshold and gripped the heavy oak frame. Thorne called out, his voice rising in a sharp command. But she ignored him. She swung the door shut with a force that rattled the glass. The sound of the latch clicking was absolute. She took Leo's hand and began to walk. The library was a tomb of silence. Angelus locked the heavy double doors, the bolt sliding home with a finality that echoed against the floor-to-ceiling shelves. She moved to her father's desk, her fingers tracing the edge of the mahogany until she found the seam he had described in his final note. It was not a drawer, but a panel hidden behind a row of leather-bound ledgers. She pushed. The panel gave way with a soft, mechanical click, Revealing a recessed port, she pulled a small drive from her pocket, the metal cold against her skin, and slotted it into the interface. The main server hummed, a low vibration that traveled through the soles of her feet. She bypassed the primary firewall, her keystrokes rapid and precise. The screen flickered, then stabilized. A cascade of blue light washed over her, reflecting in her eyes as the hidden drive initialized. She did not blink. Rows of encrypted files began to scroll, a digital waterfall of secrets that had been buried for years. She watched the progress bar crawl toward completion. She reached out, her hand hovering over the keyboard, and initiated the first download. The room felt smaller, the air tighter, as the truth began to bleed onto the monitor. Angelus leaned into the monitor, the blue light sharpening the lines of her face. She opened the first folder labeled Acquisitions. A map appeared, showing vast tracts of land in the northern sector. She cross-referenced the coordinates with the company's internal ledger. The land had been purchased through a shell corporation, then immediately sold back to Vance Industries at triple the market value. She clicked to the next file. Offshore accounts, a web of transactions linked directly to Thorne's private holdings. Millions of dollars were bleeding out of the company every quarter, funneled through these ghost entities to hide the deficit. She pulled up the merger documents. It was not a growth strategy. It was a liquidation plan. Thorne was stripping the assets, selling off the manufacturing plants, and leaving the core business hollowed out. Every document she opened was a new layer of betrayal. She scanned the timestamps, the signatures, the digital breadcrumbs left by Thorne's own hand. The evidence was undeniable. He was not just mismanaging the firm, he was actively dismantling it piece by piece to line his own pockets. She sat back, the chair groaning under her weight. The reality of the theft hit her with the force of a physical blow. The company was being cannibalized from the inside out, and Thorne had been the architect. Angelus clicked on a folder marked Medical. It contained her father's private health records from the months leading up to his death. She opened the latest entry, dated 3 days before the funeral. The doctor's notes described a man in peak physical condition, with no signs of the heart failure the board had cited as the cause of death. She scrolled further. Another document appeared, a pharmacy log, for a prescription that had never been filled. She stood up, pacing the length of the library, the floorboards creaking under her boots. She returned to the screen and pulled up the official death certificate. The time of death listed was 4 hours earlier than the security logs from the estate gate. She stared at the discrepancy. Her father had been marked as deceased while he was still logged into the building's internal network. She traced the digital signature on the medical report. It was a forgery, authorized by a terminal within the executive suite. The air in the room grew heavy. Thorne had not just stolen the company. He had cleared the path by removing the only person who could stop him. It was a calculated execution. Angelus shut the laptop. The screen went black, reflecting her own face. She stared at her reflection, consciously relaxing the tension in her jaw and softening her gaze. She practiced the look, eyes slightly downcast, shoulders slumped, a posture of defeat. She stood up and walked to the hallway mirror. She smoothed her hair, ensuring she looked disheveled enough to seem exhausted by grief. She took a deep breath, forcing her breathing to become shallow and uneven. She walked toward the kitchen. As she stepped into the room, she let her pace slow, dragging her feet slightly against the hardwood. When she saw Thorne's assistant near the counter, she stopped, gripped the back of a chair, and looked away. She did not speak. She simply stared at the floor, letting her hands tremble just enough to be noticed. Angelus walked into the boardroom and took the seat furthest from the head of the table. She kept her head tilted downward, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Thorne did not even acknowledge her arrival. He continued to pace the length of the room, gesturing aggressively toward the projection screen. He spoke of liquidating assets and shifting capital into shell accounts. He was loud, his voice booming against the glass walls. Fueled by the assumption that Angelus was too broken to comprehend the numbers, she pulled a small digital recorder from her pocket, keeping it hidden beneath the table. She pressed the button. The device hummed silently. Thorne stopped near her chair, leaning over the mahogany surface to sign a stack of papers. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He mentioned the merger, referring to the falsified signatures he had used to bypass the legal review board. Angelus did not look up. She focused on the rhythm of his breathing, the cadence of his arrogance, and the specific names of the offshore banks he cited. Every word was captured. Thorne grew more careless, tossing a confidential file onto the table within her reach. He turned his back to pour a drink. His guard completely dropped. The house fell silent after midnight. Angelus moved through the dark hallway, her footsteps soundless on the marble floor. She entered the library and locked the door. She pulled the heavy volumes of corporate bylaws from the shelves, stacking them in a jagged tower on the desk. She opened the first ledger, the pages brittle and yellowed. She began to read. Her eyes scanned thousands of lines of dense, technical jargon. Hours passed. Her neck ached, and the ink began to blur under the dim desk lamp. She hit a wall of impenetrable clauses. She stood up, paced the length of the room, and returned to the desk with a fresh pot of coffee. She started again. She traced the flow of capital and the specific voting requirements Thorne had cited. A pattern emerged. She circled the paragraph with a heavy pen. The text was dry, but it was a weapon. She leaned back, the weight of the discovery settling in her chest. Thorne had built his fortress on a foundation of arrogance, but he had left one door unlocked. She began to map out the legal steps. The 1994 amendment was buried in the appendix, a forgotten footnote in a volume that had not been opened for decades. Angelus traced the ink with her fingernail, her breath hitching as the implications took hold. It was a legacy clause, designed by the founders to protect the company from internal rot. It stated that any minority shareholder holding the legacy key could trigger an immediate, mandatory audit of all corporate accounts. The room felt suddenly cold. She flipped to the back of the ledger, searching for a definition of the key. It was not a digital password or a legal signature. It was a physical seal, a heavy metal stamp kept in a secure location, intended to be used only in the event of a total board collapse. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. She had been searching for a loophole in the law, but she had found a physical trigger instead. She grabbed her notebook and began to cross-reference the company's old property records. If the seal existed, it had to be stored in a place Thorne could not touch. She found a reference to a private safe deposit box, listed under a dormant account number. She closed the ledger, the sound sharp in the quiet room. The legal battle was over. The hunt for the weapon had begun. The bank lobby was sterile and quiet. Angelus walked toward the vault section, her pulse thrumming against her ribs. She presented the dormant account number and the faded authorization slip she had recovered from her father's files. The clerk behind the glass partition tapped a keyboard, the sound rhythmic and agonizingly slow. Angelus kept her gaze steady, watching the reflection in the polished brass of the counter. If Thorne had flagged this account, the alarm would sound now. The clerk stopped typing and looked up, eyes narrowing. He asked for secondary identification. Angelus reached into her bag, her fingers brushing the cold metal of a spare key, and produced a notarized document from her father's estate. The clerk scanned it, returned with a small, dust-covered box. He slid it through the slot. Angelus took the box to a private booth and pried the lid open. Inside, resting on velvet, was the heavy metal seal. She tucked the seal into her bag and walked out. The weapon was secured. Back at the estate, the silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of a victim, but the quiet of a coiled spring. Angelus placed the heavy metal seal inside a locked drawer, the metallic click echoing through the library. She spent the next 48 hours rehearsing the sequence of events. She mapped the boardroom layout, calculating exactly where Thorne would stand, and the precise moment she would need to intervene. She watched from the upper landing as Thorne paced the foyer below, his movements fluid and arrogant. He was practicing his speech, his voice booming against the marble walls, entirely convinced that the company was already his. He did not look up. He did not notice the shadow watching him from the balcony. Angelus retreated to her room and laid out her notes one last time. Every contingency was accounted for. Every legal hurdle was anticipated. She looked at the clock on the wall, the second hand sweeping forward with mechanical indifference. The annual shareholders' meeting was only hours away. She checked the seal one final time, feeling the sharp edges of the metal against her thumb. She stood up and walked toward the door. The library was a tomb of mahogany and dust. Angelus pulled the heavy curtains shut, sealing out the afternoon light, until the room was swallowed by shadows. She moved to the desk, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. On the corner of the blotter sat a framed photograph of her father. She picked it up. The glass was cool against her skin, the image inside captured in a moment of genuine laughter. She traced the edge of the frame, her movements slow and deliberate. The silence in the room was absolute, pressing against her eardrums like deep water. She set the frame face down. The piece of the house was a lie. A thin veneer stretched over the rot Thorn had cultivated. She walked to the window and cracked it open just an inch. The air outside was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and approaching rain. She listened to the distant, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The estate felt smaller now, the walls closing in. She turned away from the window, her gaze fixed on the door, and waited. The first black sedan crunched onto the gravel driveway at precisely 8 o'clock. It was followed by 2 more, moving in a tight, synchronized formation. The engines cut out simultaneously, leaving a sudden, ringing silence in the courtyard. Doors opened with a metallic click. Men in dark suits stepped out, their movements practiced and efficient. They did not look at the house, they looked at their watches. Angelus watched from the shadows of the upper hallway, her breath steady, her pulse barely registering a change. They walked toward the entrance, with the heavy, rhythmic gait of men who owned the ground they stepped on. They were laughing, a low, dismissive sound. They entered the foyer, their voices echoing against the marble. Thorn met them at the threshold, his smile wide and predatory. They shook hands, a display of mutual greed. Angelus turned away from the window, the metal seal heavy in her pocket. The trap was set. She walked toward the stairs, her footsteps silent, ready to descend into the center of their world and tear it apart. The boardroom doors swung open, and the shareholders filed in, their voices a low hum of anticipation. They took their seats, sliding leather chairs back with a synchronized scrape against the floor. At the head of the table, the air felt charged, heavy with the weight of impending finality. Thorn stood at the center of the room, his hands resting on the back of the primary chair. He scanned the faces of the board members, his gaze lingering on each one. He did not rush. He moved to the podium with a slow, deliberate stride, his heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. He placed his palms flat on the surface, leaning forward until his shadow stretched across the documents laid out before him. The room fell into a sudden, absolute silence. He looked out over the assembly, his expression fixed in a mask of total confidence. He looked at the clock on the wall, then back to the room, his smile widening as he prepared to speak the words that would seal the company's fate. Thorn opened his mouth to speak, but the sound died in his throat. From the very back of the room, a chair scraped against the marble. Angelus stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely unexpected. She did not look at the board members. She looked only at the podium. She stepped into the center aisle. Her heels hit the floor with a rhythmic, metallic click that echoed against the high ceiling. Each step was measured, steady, and devoid of hesitation. The room, previously filled with the low murmur of anticipation, went deathly still. Thorn watched her, his posture stiffening, his hand hovering over the documents. Angelus did not quicken her pace. She walked past the rows of shareholders, her gaze fixed forward. A few board members shifted in their seats, their heads turning in unison to track her progress. She reached the midpoint of the aisle and stopped for a single heartbeat. She looked directly at Thorn, her expression unreadable, then resumed her walk. The sound of her footsteps seemed to grow louder with every yard, a steady, relentless pulse that cut through the silence. She reached the front of the room. She stopped inches from the mahogany surface. The distance between her and the podium vanished. Thorn leaned back, his fingers twitching against the edge of the desk, his confidence wavering as he stared down at her. Angelus did not speak. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the heavy metal seal. It caught the overhead light, a dull, cold gleam that drew every eye in the room. She held it suspended for a heartbeat, the weight of it pulling at her wrist. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to swallow the very air. She shifted her grip, the metal biting into her palm, and brought it down. The seal struck the polished wood with the force of a falling hammer. The sound exploded through the room, sharp and violent, echoing like a gunshot against the glass walls. The vibration traveled through the table, rattling the crystal glasses and the stack of documents. Every person in the room flinched. Thorn jolted backward, his eyes widening as the heavy metal bit into the wood. The echo died away, leaving a ringing stillness in its wake. No one moved. No one breathed. The room was locked in a state of stunned, paralyzed disbelief. The echo of the strike faded, but the tension remained, coiled tight in the center of the room. Angelus did not retreat. She leaned forward, her hands pressed flat against the table, her gaze locked onto Thorn. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, yet it carried to every corner of the chamber, cold and precise as a blade. "I am invoking the legacy audit," she said. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Thorn stared at the seal, then up at her, his lips parting as if to protest, but no sound emerged. The arrogance that had defined his posture for weeks evaporated. His face turned a sickly, pale gray, the blood draining away until his features looked sharp and hollow. He gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles turning white, his eyes darting toward the board members as if looking for an ally who was no longer there. He looked smaller, diminished by the metal object that now sat between them. Angelus held his gaze, her expression devoid of any flicker of mercy or doubt. She remained perfectly still, a statue of resolve, watching the realization of his downfall settle into his eyes. The room began to shift, the silence breaking into a low, frantic hum. Thorn slammed his hand against the podium, his voice cracking as he tried to reclaim the room. "This is a fabrication! A desperate, illegal stunt!" He gestured wildly toward the board, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He reached out to shove the documents aside, but his fingers slipped, scattering papers across the floor. He stopped, his chest heaving, realizing the board members were not looking at him. They were staring at the seal. The heavy metal object sat on the wood, a silent, immovable witness to the bylaws he had tried to bury. He tried to speak again, but the words died in his throat. A board member in the front row stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. "The legacy key is verified by the charter," the man muttered, his voice trembling. "If she has the seal, the audit is mandatory." A ripple of movement spread through the rows of seats. People began to stand, their faces tight with fear, eyes darting toward the exits. Thorn looked around, his mouth working silently, searching for a rebuttal that no longer existed. He was alone at the center of the room, the walls of his own making closing in. The murmurs grew into a low, frantic roar, the sound of a ship taking on water. The chaos in the room reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices arguing over liability and legal standing. Then, the heavy double doors at the rear of the chamber swung open. The sound was sharp, mechanical, and final. A line of men and women in dark, structured professional attire walked in, moving with a synchronized, rhythmic pace that cut through the noise. They carried metal cases and digital tablets, their expressions entirely neutral. The room went silent. The board members backed away from the center aisle, clearing a path as if the auditors were a physical force. Angelus did not move, her gaze locked on the lead auditor. Without a word, the team fanned out, moving toward the main server racks and the executive desks. One auditor reached the table where Thorn stood, placing a series of legal notices directly onto the mahogany surface. Thorn watched them, his hands hanging limp at his sides, his eyes wide as he realized the seizure was absolute. The silence shattered, when a board member near the back lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at Thorne. "He forced the signature! I have the emails!" The shout echoed off the high ceilings, acting as a catalyst for the rest. Another man jumped up, his face flushed, waving a tablet in the air. "I have the offshore logs." Thorne held the keys to the private accounts. The room erupted into a cacophony of overlapping accusations. Members were no longer colleagues. They were predators turning on their own. They shoved past each other to reach the auditors, thrusting phones and documents into the officials' hands, desperate to be the first to offer evidence in exchange for immunity. Thorne stood frozen, his eyes darting between the people who had been his allies only minutes ago. A woman grabbed his arm, screaming about a secret merger. Thorne tried to push her away, but he was swarmed. He was no longer the CEO. He was the target. The auditors continued their work, unmoved by the shouting, as the board members clawed at each other, their desperation turning into a violent, chaotic scramble for self-preservation. The lead auditor ignored the shouting, walking to the central console. With a sharp, metallic click, he inserted a drive. The massive projector screen above the podium flickered, then flooded the room with a harsh white light. The chaotic noise of the board members died down as they looked up. A spreadsheet appeared, rows of offshore accounts highlighted in red. The screen scrolled rapidly, revealing the illegal land grabs and the secret merger documents that Angelus had unearthed. Thorne stared up, his jaw slack. The evidence was undeniable. Each line of code and every timestamp acted as a nail in the coffin of his career. The board members stopped their shoving, their eyes glued to the display as their own names appeared in the transaction logs, linked directly to the fraudulent activity. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the low, steady hum of the cooling fans and the projector. Every person in the room could see the path of the money. Thorne turned toward the screen, his face drained of all color, his hands trembling as he realized there was no longer any room for denial. The heavy double doors at the rear of the boardroom swung open with a sharp, resonant crack. Two officers in uniform stepped into the room, their boots clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. The board members instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path toward the podium. Thorne did not move. He stood rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on the screen behind him. One officer approached him, the jingle of metal equipment cutting through the lingering hum of the projector. Thorne finally turned, his eyes darting toward the exit, but the path was blocked by the silent, watchful board members. The officer reached out, gripping Thorne by the arm. Thorne jerked back, but the second officer moved in, pinning his other side. The sound of steel ratcheting shut echoed clearly in the quiet room. Thorne's hands were pulled behind his back, the metal links biting into his wrists. He stumbled forward as the officers guided him toward the doors. He looked out at the room, searching for a single ally, but found only averted eyes and cold, blank stares. The reign of the CEO had reached its absolute, physical end. The boardroom doors remained closed, the echo of the arrest still vibrating in the air. Thorne was gone, but the tension in the room intensified. The board members stood frozen, their eyes darting between the empty podium and the center of the room where Angelus stood. A low murmur began to ripple through the rows of mahogany chairs. One by one, the directors stood up, their movements jagged and uncertain. They began to drift toward the edges of the room, creating a wide, empty space in the center. It was a calculated retreat. They were shedding their association with the previous regime, their eyes scanning the floor to avoid meeting hers. Angelus did not move. As she took a single step toward the podium, the remaining shareholders near her path recoiled, pushing back against the walls to clear her way. The room was no longer a place of debate. It was a vacuum, and she was the only object left standing. She reached the podium. She looked out at the sea of averted faces, the power structure dismantled. She had claimed the center of the storm. The silence in the boardroom stretched, heavy and thick. Angelus remained at the podium, her fingers gripping the edge of the wood until the knuckles turned pale. The rush of adrenaline that had sustained her through the audit began to ebb, leaving a sudden, sharp tremor in her hands. She exhaled, a long, slow sound that seemed to rattle in the quiet space. She reached down and gathered the scattered legal files, stacking them into a precise pile. Her movements were mechanical, stripped of any wasted motion. She looked toward the back of the room where Leo stood, his eyes wide, watching her. She signaled for him to approach. As he reached her side, she placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward the exit. The board members remained pressed against the walls, their faces pale, their eyes tracking her progress. She walked past them, the rhythmic click of her heels, the only sound. She pushed through the heavy glass doors and out into the hallway, the air cooling against her skin. She pulled the documents tight against her chest, shielding them, shielding Leo. Outside, the city lights blurred into streaks. She reached the elevator, pressed the button, and leaned her head against the cool metal wall. The battle was over. The estate was silent. Angelus stepped into the foyer, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her with a finality that echoed through the high ceilings. She walked past the empty library, her footsteps muffled by the thick rugs. She stopped in the center of the hall, near the floor-to-ceiling mirror that hung between the portraits of her father. She reached out, her fingertips tracing the cold, smooth surface of the glass. She looked at her own image. The girl who had stood by the casket weeks ago was gone. In her place, a woman stared back with eyes that did not soften. The gaze was steady, sharp, and entirely devoid of the hesitation that had once defined her. She leaned closer, examining the set of her jaw, and the way she held her shoulders rigid, defensive, and ready for a strike. She touched her cheek, but the skin felt foreign under her own hand. There was no warmth in the reflection, only the cold, precise calculation of a survivor. She turned her head, watching the way the light caught the hard lines of her face. The softness of her youth had been traded away, replaced by the weight of the company she now held. She stood there for a long time, watching the stranger in the glass. Angelus walked toward the study. The floorboards groaned under her weight, a sound that usually signaled age, but now felt like a warning to anyone who dared enter. She pushed the heavy door open. The room smelled of stale paper and expensive leather. She walked to the desk, pulled the chair back, and sat. The mahogany surface was cold against her palms. She reached for the lamp and clicked it on. The light cut through the dark, illuminating the stack of documents. She did not hesitate. She pulled a fountain pen from the holder, unscrewed the cap, and began to read. Her eyes scanned the lines of the merger agreement, identifying the loopholes she would exploit by morning. She reached for the phone, dialed the secretary, and gave a series of precise, clipped commands regarding the morning board meeting. She did not ask for input. She did not seek approval. She hung up and stared at the empty chair across from her, the chair where her father once sat. She felt no grief. She felt only the rhythm of the machine she now controlled. She pulled a ledger closer, dipped the pen in ink, and began to write. The house was silent, but the silence was no longer empty. It was the sound of a game being played, and for the first time, she was the one holding the pieces. She turned the page, the sound sharp and crisp, and continued to work until the first light of dawn.